Ornithology.
What a fine achievement for Cheltenham Town.
Hello and welcome to the second episode of Ornithology, a podcast from the Robins Trust. My name's Jamie. I'm a board member at the Robins Trust, and we've produced this podcast for Robins Trust members to help everyone get a bit more understanding about how the club works and to just appreciate the day-to-day work involved. In this episode, we're speaking to Dave Beesley, who is Vice Chair of the Robins Trust, but he also, very luckily for all of us, happens to be a fan-elected director. Cheltenham Town are in an incredibly lucky position to have someone who is representing one of the large owners in the Robins Trust on the board, but with a sort of remit to make sure that the fans' voice is always heard and taken into consideration every decision that's made. So I spoke to Dave, again, like the previous episode last month, where I spoke to Paul Baker, during the time that we were going through a bit of a rough patch. Hopefully when you're listening to this, that's no longer the case. But I spoke to Dave about how he balances the role of being the fan-elected director representing the fans in the Robins Trust, while also being a full director of the business in the form of the football club and the responsibilities he has there. And we also spoke a bit about how the board works, how the work is divided up between the board members, how an agenda is set, what an agenda looks like, and just how the business takes place throughout the year. So I hope you'll find this interesting. If you're listening and you're not currently a Robins Trust member, you can go to robinstrust.org/join, and you can join now for as little as £10 a year. That will make you a full voting member. Or if you'd like to support our work further, then it is a minimum of £5 a month to be an investor. So here's my chat with Dave Beesley. I wanted to ask you first off about the general responsibilities of being a director of a football club, because I think it's important that we underline that you're the fan-elected director, but you are the same as everyone else, an equal director on the board of Cheltenham Town. So what does that role entail, and or what are the main responsibilities?
I'm glad you clarified that, actually, because I think that is something that gets lost occasionally. I think there is a perception in the fan base that the fan-elected director role is a lower-level director role, and that there are certain things that I'm required to sit out of, let's say budget setting, let's say discussion on major employees' positions. All of that falls under a full director's remit, and the FED in its position is a full director. And I suppose at its core, it is maintaining and protecting the livelihood of the business, ensuring it's financially stable, it's run well. But on top of that, football is a unique industry. Football clubs are what we know in the trust sphere as a community asset, something that is borrowed, not owned, even though it is on paper owned. And we are temporary custodians, and we need to ensure that we leave it in the same or better place than we found it, to be honest, and it's ready for the next generation of ownership and board members.
With that, balancing the fact that you obviously have, in the terms of being a director of any company, you have a responsibility as a sort of custodian to the shareholders of the company. You have a sort of dual role then as a fan-elected director, also as a representative. The Robins Trust invested a certain amount of money at one point, and that allowed us to have a seat on the board.
Paul Baker at the time was chairman and probably majority shareholder, or at least greater percentage shareholder than he is now. And he laid down the gauntlet, raise £100,000, you can have a seat on the board. And by virtue of then Trust Secretary Brian Jacob passing away and leaving his entire estate to the Trust, the Trust, prior to my time, was able to invest a lot more than that £100,000. Mr. Baker kept his promise, and we got a seat on the board, and it was through various processes decided it would be an elected position, elected every 2 years on rotation. And both sides have held up their bargain along the way. The board is appointed by the majority shareholding, and that majority shareholding could be any combination of probably at the moment the top four shareholders, which are CTFC Investment Limited, Simon Keswick, Paul Baker, and the Trust.
I guess we like to think that as we've got just under 10% of the shares, this is the Robins Trust, has just under 10% of the club at the moment. If we can grow that and get more members, hopefully we would always be protecting that having a seat on the board, possibly more representation if we could get the funds for it.
Yeah, the greater membership base is twofold, because it increases our shareholding, because we will always attempt to buy shares in the club with any money that is invested in the trust. We can use a small, we have allowances in our constitution to spend some of that money on marketing and growing the trust. But on the whole, we try to invest all that money in the club. So that helps the club, it helps us. And equally, the more members we have, the more valid the FED role and its voice in the boardroom, me and those who follow, will have. And therefore, more credence will be paid to their viewpoint.
And is the fan-elected director role, as I understand it, there's not that many of them in the country, but is that role outlined by the FSA or something like that, or is it interpreted in different ways, each club that has one?
The FSA, and you're great to bring them up, the Football Sports Association, they are the umbrella organisation that looks after football trusts. Whilst they don't have a one-size-fits-all kind of structure for how FEDs should run, they are very supportive in the role. We do hold monthly meetings, which I attempt to attend when I can, between all the FEDs in the top 4 or 5 divisions. At last count, there were about 20 or so of us. And they've been incredibly supportive in the early days, because when I first took over as FED, the trust wasn't in the best position. The FED role was a little less respected and a little less trusted, I feel, at the time, due to circumstances that had happened before me. Not at the fault of either of the FEDs that preceded me, Clive or Murray, but more in the fact the trust was mistrusted, to use a terrible term, because it had become a little bit militant, it had become a little bit anti-club. And we've attempted to move that back towards being what the FSA like to refer to as a critical friend.
You have monthly meetings, is that right? The boards, other than if you have certain business that comes up in between that?
Yeah, we have standard board meetings that we try to adhere to about once a month. Sometimes they have to move due to school holidays, that kind of thing. We can't put a quorum together. But there's once a month. They're usually an afternoon, and they follow a very similar structure each time. Anyone who's got experience being on a board or a committee will know that there's certain procedures you have to follow, like ratification of the previous meetings, apologies for non-attendance. And then usually first item on the agenda is football matters. That varies from month to month, depending on what part of the season we're in, because sometimes it can be about injuries. It can be about how we put the team together on the pitch, what fixtures are coming out. Other times it's to do with transfers, and it can be, and that can vary from things are going great to we might be about to go over budget. We need to sign this player, but something crops up on his medical, little things like that.
Any of the playing side management staff there, the manager or director of football or anyone, or head of recruitment, I think Russell Milne is now, they at the board meetings as well, or is this just the club board?
Again, that varies from requirement to requirement. Mickey used to attend a lot, Wade regularly as well. But if we've got a match, because board meetings are usually on a Friday, if we've got a match on a Saturday with an overnight stay, then the manager tends to have to be on the coach by that point, and he usually sends a written report.
The sort of footballing side, that's the first item usually, or after the apologies, ratification of previous minutes, etc.
Yeah, I mean, so that, due to the fact that we're all football fans and we're all really interested in football, that sometimes dominates more time than it should. But then we launch onto other matters, commercial matters, finance, safeguarding has a huge role. We don't just employ adult footballers. We have an academy to run. We have youngsters to ensure that they're safeguarded, and then we've got buildings to maintain. We've got a stadium. We've got a training ground. Any matters that are arising there come up at that meeting too. I have my own dedicated section for fan issues or anything that's come out of more recent things like the fan-led review. So we cover all bases in these meetings, but maybe a meeting will have more emphasis on finance one month when we're setting budgets, commercial one month when we're trying to set out the commercial strategy for the coming season. They're flexible.
Regarding the section that you have to sort of feedback, how do you canvass fan opinion, and how do you, because obviously there's some voices are louder than others. A small group on social media might make a lot of noise about something. How do you kind of sift that out and work out how to communicate that back to the board?
It's a difficult one, and it is one I'll have to throw my hands up and say that as a trust and as an individual, we're not the best at it at times. We were a lot better last season when we had our wonderful SLO Jenny. We had the visual presence of the information hut in the club car park. Unfortunately, that hut was part of the scheme that came with the last caterers, and it wasn't renewed. And unfortunately, conversations for another day, but Jenny stood down from that SLO role. We all tend to have our eye on social media. People will, if I haven't seen something, people will give me a nudge and say, look, this is happening. People are talking about this. And if a matter is gaining quite a lot of attention, then it is really worth looking at. Catering issues that we've had over the last couple of seasons have been a case in point that comes up every match. It's something that we've had to push, but again, due to contractual reasons, we've had to see out contracts before we can make changes as well. We do have to be better at gathering this information. I know you've been setting up some wonderful surveys throughout the season to canvass opinion. My email address is always available. It's fed@robinstrust.org, and you can DM me on Twitter @Dave Beesley. My door is always open, but like every member of that board, we've also got full-time jobs and families, so we may not get back to you straight away.
I mean, that's something to stress, actually, at this point. The board, in terms of it being a part-time volunteer position for most of the boards.
It's a part-time position for all of the board, the exception being Paul Godfrey, who is also employed by the football club as club secretary. But I suppose you'd say being a director is the secondary role to his, and it is also part-time. But he is our boots on the ground. He's our de facto CEO, let's say. He's the man with his ear to the football club's running from day to day. All of the others either in part-time or full-time employment. John Murphy is retired, but he's present at the football club, especially the training ground, day to day as well.
As we've talked often about how this is amongst the trust, about how the club structure is quite shallow, and it means that because there isn't a sort of CEO running everything, in actual fact, you each have to break up responsibilities of things that need to be overseen and kind of line manage certain things. Is that done in a formal way? Because I know you've taken over overseeing catering and things, because that was a nettle that really needed to be grasped at the end of last season, arguably for a lot of last season. How formally is that work divided up? Or is it just that once it comes up as an agenda and you realise on a meeting agenda and you realise that someone needs to deal with it, it just falls to someone one way or another?
We're lucky in the fact we've got a board of diverse skill sets. David Bloxham, the chairman, comes from a legal background, so we can cover off a lot of legal stuff and employment stuff through him. It's his niche, but he also acts as a chairman should, as a major port of call for the football staff, particularly the football manager. Then we move on to Paul Bentz, who is vice chairman and commercial director, and he oversees a lot of the commercial operations at the club. He's responsible for the commercial and sponsorship. He also oversees the media team. That's more now fallen to Murray Toms. Now he's rejoined the board with his background in digital marketing. Clive Gowing, with his finance background, his accountancy qualifications, runs the finances, how he maintains the management accounts, how set budgets. He also liaises with the shop manager on some aspects of running the shop as well. John Murphy, for want of a better phrase, is kind of an operations director. He looks after buildings, safety, staffing to an extent. And yeah, he'll be our eyes and ears down at the training ground in terms of when things need doing, things need fixing. He also liaises with area on our kits and kit delivery, ensuring there's enough kit alongside the kit man. Paul Godfrey, he's the club secretary. He, in terms of a directorship, he takes the minutes of the meetings, ensures that everything runs legally and stably. But from a football side, he's Superman. He runs everything you'd expect a club secretary to do, and from making sure that player signings are run correctly, that we conform to certifications. But I think he goes far and beyond his role of club secretary at the moment, and that's, I think, where we talked about him being de facto CEO because of the fact that he's the boots on the ground at any given time.
There's always the capacity issues that come up. It leads to certain decisions being made sometimes, or things being done certain ways, or things that get neglected. It does sort of feel like it's a lot of people for being quite stretched for a part-time role.
Yeah, there's only so much time you have around your day job to fit stuff in, and in that there will also be a temptation to do the stuff that interests you more, which can inadvertently, I don't think anybody purposely neglects anything. I think you just end up doing the thing that requires the most attention or gives the best reward.
I've spoken to Paul Baker. How do the boards interact with the owners?
A few of the owners, Paul Baker especially, is there on match days. I try and be in the boardroom for about 30-40% of matches a season, but I also like to be on the terraces too. I have met a couple of times the representative from CTFC Investments Limited. I've not yet met Simon Keswick, but that kind of implies there is an informal relationship really between the owners. I think Paul Godfrey and David Bloxham have more of a day-to-day or week-to-week closer relationship with the ownership group, as we tend to call it in the trust. my main report back is to the trust. I know Paul Baker pretty well, and we've met a few times for meetings.
Well, I guess we should highlight that the trust is in quite an enviable position here, because we're only one of the four main shareholders who directly has representation on the board. Always worth highlighting to trust members.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at any time, any of those other three could proxy their shares to a board member if it came to any kind of major shareholders vote, let's say. I have seen in discussions recently about how shares relate to votes on the board, and I think that's an unfair correlation. Once you get into that boardroom as a board member, you are one of 7 as it stands. So it doesn't matter whether I have 9% of the shareholding behind me and say one board member has the shares of one of the owners proxy to them. It's just one member, one vote in that room. Everyone's opinion is equal. And when it comes down to a vote, it's one vote per person.
I wonder if it helps the efficiency of that democracy now having 7 people in the boardroom again rather than 6. I mean, I guess it depends what you're voting on and how things split.
Yeah, when we've had even numbers, I think at one point we did have a 6-member board and it came down to it, and we did have one vote that was a 3-3. In those instances, the chairman does have the casting vote. It's whether they choose to exercise it. If it's a very major issue, sometimes it might be like, look, we need to negotiate this more. We need to discuss this more, because if it's this split, I can't be the one who throws a decision in. It needs to be given more time.
One of the things I wanted to ask about as well, this is quite a broad question, so I guess there's so many different ways of looking at it, but how the board react to sort of crises in general, how do you communicate? Because I guess you have other communication channels to get together. Yeah, how do you react when there's something very significant that needs to be reacted to?
We don't just stick to formal meetings. We do have, as everyone does nowadays, WhatsApp groups, each other's phone numbers. When you speak of crises, I don't think we've really had any huge crises in my time there. The coronavirus pandemic was one thing that affected the whole industry, and we almost kind of just followed each other's lead. We followed good examples with certain aspects. The EFL, the FA, the Premier League, they all kind of guided us. The closest thing you could probably get to needing a ring round or a WhatsApp group is when you say get to transfer deadline day, is deals changing all the time, and we have an opportunity to sign this player, but we might have to go over budget. We can recoup that at a later date. Brilliant, get it done. This player has an issue on his medical. Okay, if the management staff are happy, we can overlook it. That's more of the time when we have to kind of contact each other outside of meetings. And maybe when there's a certain thing coming, like the rack thing at schools recently, the first thing we had to do was contact each other and make sure that our structures were sound and we hadn't got any rack in there. That was something we had to do quickly because there was a match coming up.
You mentioned medicals and things like that. So we've gone through a bit of an injury crisis. Sounds very drastic, but we've had an issue at the moment with quite a large number of players being injured. This is, speaking September 2023. When you plan for the future and things like that, is that something that the board would discuss about whether there's anything to do with the conditioning, the medical approach, things like that, or whether are you asking the questions about whether there's anything contributing to a large number of injuries, or is that just delegated to the medical staff and the board don't get involved in it?
I mean, ultimately, we employ experts and to use them for their expertise. And we do employ, strength and conditioning coaching. We employ physiotherapists, and they've been with us several years now. So I don't think this is a personnel thing. I think it's just a lot of pure bad luck at the same time in this current scenario. It might be that we find that there is a correlation between the injuries and something really obscure causing it. Hard pitches, a change in training regime that we haven't noted. But that's not something we would intervene in unless it was glaringly obvious. Say, we've brought in a new strength and conditioning coach and these injuries have started, or we've noticed we've changed tactical style and that means the players are running an extra 5 kilometres and that's causing muscle injuries.
So that takes us on to the kind of planning for the future thing. That each year, I guess, each summer, you must get together and have some idea about what needs to be achieved in the sort of short term to get the club together, fielding a team for the forthcoming season. But how do the board plan for the next 5 years, 10 years?
Long-term financial planning is difficult because you never really know where you're going to be in 5 years. With the best will in the world, we'd hope to be in League One still. If we go on a good run, we could be in the Championship and have a lot more money to work with. Or, if things an unfortunate second set of circumstances happen and we find ourselves in League Two or the National League, we're going to have to cut our cloth accordingly. Usually around April, we start, probably before that, Clive will start drawing up potential budgets and we'll start to realise what scenarios may play out. This time, April this year, we barely knew we were going to stay up. We knew we weren't going to affect the playoffs either. So we knew we'd be playing in League One this year. And we could, without knowing whether there'd be any structural changes to the finances that come from the Football League and the Premier League, set a budget around that. We knew which players were going out of contract. We knew which positions we needed to fill. So we could give that budget initially to Mickey Moore and then on to Wade and Russell in the new structure. But that's what we do. We on the whole, we give them a budget and trust them as football experts to do what they do. The only time we intervene is if there are exceptional circumstances. We need to go over budget, or a run of player injuries. We need to get an emergency loan, or a player has failed a medical or had something of note on their medical, and we need to kind of agree that we're going to trust the experts to work around that.
I have some other sort of quite small miscellaneous questions. So I thought one that's quite helpful is to talk about both collective responsibility and openness, because I think I want to communicate that to people. Some of the criticism that we've been getting about the trust is that the FED isn't feeding back. We're not hearing about the things that the FED has proposed, the club decide not to do or decide to do, and things like that. So I just wondered if you wanted to make any comment on that and your underlining your role as a director of a limited company.
I think the important thing I've said along is that I'm one voice in seven, and I try to represent the 4,000 or so voices that turn up at the stadium every week, and maybe the further 5,000 or 10,000 that are more casual fans or watch from afar and I follow. But at the end of the day, when I get into that room, I'm one voice among seven and one vote among seven. And if a decision is made, even if it's contrary to what I would prefer or I think fans would prefer, as you say, we have a collective responsibility. That's the decision the board has made. So we then follow through with it. Some of those discussions could be commercially sensitive, so therefore they stay within the four walls of the board. Some of them are protected by things like GDPR. There's no way the fans need to know what specific players are earning or who we're going to sign next summer, really, especially as if we're looking at signing a player next summer and us mentioning it would then lead to other clubs signing it, let's say.
Do you think the board could be a bit more open? Because I was talking to Murray about this, and I was saying that there seems to be this presumption of kind of silence or not showing too much of how things work. And I'm sure it's capacity. I'm sure it's not like a deliberate kind of secrecy. But do you think that via you as the FED, we as the trust could perhaps provide people with a bit more information about board meetings?
The summary of the view I tend to see, like you've seen as well from the fan base, is I don't know what's going on at the club. I think that's generally what we hear. Whereas the counter to that, the board seem to say, well, we're quite open and we're all friends and we're all fans and we can all be approached in the bar. We're all in the bar after games, available via various email addresses and social media. If people have a question, they can ask. So there's a gulf between those two positions that we probably need to find a middle ground on. And that potentially starts with something I've brought up with the board before about a memorandum of understanding between trust and the club on a lot of issues. But one of those could be what subjects are open to broadcast, what subjects not, and that clarifies the position, because quite often I will come out of a board meeting and I think it's handy for the fans to know that, but I don't know if I can tell. And yeah, sure, it's easy to just go, can I say this? But at times you think, well, if I'm constantly doing that, that's counterproductive. Others will err on the side of caution as well. So the answer would probably be no. Whereas if we've got a written framework, how I operate between those two entities, because I cross the line between the two, we could perhaps move forward and bridge that gap between the two communication viewpoints.
People feel, I think it's something that came up in our chat on the Robins report, if people don't hear anything, they assume nothing's happening, which I know from even our trust meetings is really far from the truth.
The subject of the memorandum of understanding has come up a few times. I mean, sometimes it's being derailed due to the coronavirus pandemic, those kind of things taking precedence, and other events that take our eye off of what would be seen as the more maintenance projects. It could do with being done now. That's all I'll say.
How do the other board members at the club feel about the Robins Trust and the contribution we do make and can make?
There's always going to be a level of mistrust is the wrong word. I can't find the right word, but because of the nature of the fact that we don't want everything that is commercially sensitive being broadcast to the fans, there will always be the worry in the minds of some of those board members of how much of this is going through the trust and out. I'd also say that, again, there might be an unconscious bias towards the fact that our stated ambitions are that we would like to own the football club one day. We want to be the next custodians of the football club. We're not saying the current owners aren't fit for purpose at all, but we want to ensure that the next set of owners are, and whether it's us or whether we have a greater say in who it is because we've got a louder voice at the table when shares get sold or divested. But because our stated aim is to own the football club, there probably may be a little bit of unintentional protectionism, let's say.
So thank you to Dave for his time, and thank you for listening. As I said at the start of the podcast, if you're not a member, you can go to robinstrust.org/join and join and become part of what we're trying to do and give Dave as much support as we can get. The more people we have as members, the louder that voice is in the boardroom. And if you enjoyed listening to a podcast about Cheltenham Town, you should check out the Robins Report podcast. It comes out every week. Here's the host, Owen Knight, to tell you a little bit more about it.
Hello, my name's Owen, and I'm the host of the Robins Report podcast. Catch us on your podcast platforms every Thursday or Friday as I dissect everything CTFC with guests every week. We're very proud to be CTFC's longest serving and only weekly podcast dedicated to the Robins. Hope to have you listening soon. Thanks for listening, and as always, up the town.
We'll be going back next time where I'll be speaking to Murray Toms about how a shirt is put together and the process behind that, how it's designed, what the considerations are, and just how the process works. I hope you will join us then. This has been an Unsound production for the Robins Trust.